This is the small town of AZTEC, New Mexico, located about 2.5 hours northwest of Albuquerque, depending upon how fast you drive along the often deserted highway. It's close to the Four Corners area, that geographic landmark where the states of Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico intersect one another. Like most places, it has a story to tell. With AZTEC, however, that story goes far beyond the norm. You might even say that the AZTEC story is truly out of this world. These days, if you told a friend that you were off to New Mexico to visit the site of an alleged flying saucer crash, that friend would probably assume you were headed to Roswell. For the past 3 decades or so, this has been a pretty safe assumption, as the Roswell incident has become an integral part of American pop culture. But travel back in time to the late 1940s and early 1950s, and your friend would have assumed that you had a different destination in mind. Because long before Roswell became the most famous UFO incident, there was AZTEC, the first of the crashed flying saucer stories.
The gist of the AZTEC tale is that in 1948, a flying saucer complete with anywhere from 14 to 18 bodies crashed in AZTEC, New Mexico, and recovered under cover of high secrecy by the US military. And in various formats and permutations, the tale's been circulated for the last 50 years. Some people consider it to be an outright hoax. Some people are sitting on the fence. Other people consider it to be genuine. Some people consider it maybe it's a genuine incident, but it occurred somewhere else.
The timeline of AZTEC would be a report from the oil field workers a little after 5 a.m. on March 25th, 1948. Basically, the first report came in as a large brush fire on a mesa off of Hart Canyon Road. As the oil field workers got out there, they discovered a large disc, approximately 100 feet in diameter, sitting on top of a mesa. That had nothing to do with the brush fire, but because of the oil drip tanks out there at that time, people from El Paso Oil Company were notified that they should get out there to investigate the fire and any subsequent danger it could pose. Upon getting out there, they noticed a large disc on the mesa. The military showed up later that day, late lunchtime, early afternoon. The one local law enforcement officer had warned the locals that the military would be there eventually, that they had been notified.
AZTEC is a fascinating case because it was the original, if you will, crash flying saucer story. And it surfaced first in 1949 in columns written by Frank Scully in the Daily Variety. It ultimately led to a best-selling book that Scully wrote, and I think it sold something on the order of 60,000 copies in 1950 in hardcover, and then it went on to 12 editions overseas, and on and on and on. I mean, it was remarkable how successful it was. It's obvious he struck some kind of real chord. It was also total nonsense, and Scully was either one of these fellows who knew enough not to ask questions he didn't want to hear the answers to, or he was genuinely duped by a fellow named Silas Newton and a sidekick of his named Leo Gebauer, who became known as Dr. G in Scully's book.
In Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers, which came out in 1950, he tells the AZTEC story as told to him by Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer. Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer then introduced Frank Scully to at least 8 scientists that allegedly worked on the AZTEC crash. Frank Scully took these 8 people and molded them into one Dr. G. The skeptics like to attack the story if they haven't researched it and say that Dr. G was Leo Gebauer. Leo Gebauer was no more a scientist than anybody. He was an electrical engineer that worked with Silas Newton. More of a glorified electrician more than electrical engineer. Frank Scully in his book plainly states that Dr. G is up to 8 scientists that worked on the recovered UFO at AZTEC?
Essentially, these two guys were con men who were in the process of trying to peddle a doodle bug, which is an oil and gas industry tag for a device that will find oil and gas, but of course doesn't. And in his case, it was a machine that not only found oil and gas, but gold and water and pretty much anything the Mark was interested in finding. And on top of that, Gebauer had invented something similar, which also supposedly could assess the health of a person. So this was sort of an all-in-one, do-it-all kind of thing. But what they did, which was unusual and made their little bit unique, was that they claimed that their doodle bug was better than anybody else's because it was using technology that had been taken from the flying saucer that allegedly crashed near AZTEC. And therefore, obviously, it was far superior. Dr. G, our friend Gebauer, was supposedly a magnetics expert who was one of those called in by the Air Force when the saucer was tracked to ground near AZTEC, where it floated to ground, not actually crashed, and presumably disabled by a high-powered radar somewhere nearby. Such was the claim. Anyhow, the whole thing was a total con job. And it was quickly recognized as such and then really exposed in detail in 1952 by J.P. Kahn, who was an investigative reporter. I think he was with the San Francisco Examiner, if I'm not mistaken. And he did a 4 or 5 month investigation in detail, including managing to con the con man out of an example or a sample of the mysterious metal that the saucer was made out of. It turned out to be the sort of stuff that you made pots and pans out of, actually. But, you know, he was a very, very, very sharp reporter who did a really good job. And True Magazine published his article in 1952 exposing these guys. And this led to the district attorney in Denver, Colorado, prosecuting Newton and Gebauer for fraud and various other sorts of associated charges. Anyway, they were convicted in December of 1952. And basically the whole notion of crash flying saucers went away. And people who take flying saucers, UFOs, seriously for decades wouldn't touch anything like that with a 10-foot pole until Roswell came along.
I think where some of the skeptics attack the AZTEC story is why would 1, 2, or up to 8 scientists confide with Frank Scully? And that's an important question. But you have to look at who Frank Scully was back then. You have to look at how the media operated back then. We didn't have CNN, we didn't have national network TV. You had a very tight group of journalists, the Dorothy Kilgallons, the Walter Winchells, the Frank Scullys that, quite frankly, were the most credible people of their day in journalism. And that would probably be an automatic person that you would go to break a story like that. The other thing, if you read Frank Scully's writings, the scientists that approached him did not think that was going to be a secret for a long time. They thought that story would break within a year. They were giving Frank Scully a little advance on the AZTEC incident.
The first UFO-related documentary I made was a biography of legendary Roswell investigator Stanton T. Friedman. If the AZTEC incident has a Friedman, that is to say, someone with respected professional credentials who has chosen to undertake a search for the truth about the UFO phenomenon, it is this man, Scott Ramsey, a successful businessman